combat, but they're not really using it in combat. They're using it against civilians. So yeah.
That they make that point too,
Yeah.
and that's why they say they're so good at border control. That's the whole
Wow,
thing,
that's
because
crazy.
border control is totally about controlling civilians, right?
Yeah.
And so a lot of it, like you say, it's combat proven at first, but what they do is take those very same technologies, and then they turn them and they put a homeland security tag on it, and then turn it to population control or people control. They call it people control, I believe.
Hello and welcome to Inspired Earth. We've got a very special episode. Inspired Earth has its own first guest, and it could not be a more perfect applicable guest in that he talks about native rights, talks about the earth, climate change, our future, technology, and the intersection with all of that stuff, as well as human rights and civil rights. So it is a huge honor to have somebody like that on the program here, and he's just, I can't say enough about this guy, that he's the nicest guy ever. He's super dedicated, he's passionate, he's compassionate, and he's brave and has a huge intellect to go out into these countries around the world, very contentious places, and slug through the jungle, slug through the river, have guns pointed at him, look down the barrel of guns of people that might not speak the same language, and he's here to talk about his experiences and the lessons that he's learned. We're not going to be able to get to nearly all the stuff that we could talk about. I mean, this could be many different episodes that we could talk with this person endlessly about. He's just has so much information in his books. It is so fruitful. So we're just going to try to lay out the groundwork today, basically. This is just a groundwork laying episode. But we're blessed. We're all extremely blessed to have somebody that is so educated, not just by reading like we are or learning like we are. This is somebody that has spent time in the field, boots on the ground, and that has to be respected for the bravery that this man has, and bringing us indigenous knowledge as well as interviewing these people of indigenous regions of the earth that are being massacred, basically by our government or a lot of Western governments, and our tax dollars, in our name, in the name of freedom and security, is some of the things that these native people are being desecrated in the name of. And it all comes down to the earth and a reflection of us as a society. So we're going to be talking about some very deep stuff here, but it's primarily just a foundation laying episode. So without too much of ado, we will introduce Todd Miller, and just thank you so much for him being on. Check out his books. He has audiobooks. I listened to the audiobooks, and they're incredible. Storming the Wall was my favorite. It was the most emotional, very spiritual, fits in line with our show here perfectly. Once again, we're not able to talk about everything inside of these books because they're so vast, but we are going to talk about some pretty important topics, and tie them all together. So with that, just buy his books, check out the audio stuff, and tell him that he's the best. Thank him for being on the show, because I really appreciate it. And this is not a B-list guy. This is somebody that is on point, and I don't think it's a coincidence that he was my first guest, because of how in line his stuff is with the show. I think that this is one of those synchronistic type of things. Thank you, God, for helping us get to this point. So enjoy the show. Here we go. But I had slept pretty good last night, so I slept early. But I don't want to keep you waiting too much. So thank you so much for joining. And we'll start off with the introductions here. That just like Petra Molnar, whenever she was on the radio the other day, she gave you high praise. We'll probably only scratch the surface for this sort of stuff, but there's just so much information on your books. It's incredible. And part of the podcast that I do is Inspired Earth, which I'm sure that you read this. I sent a little intro that this is just giving space for these exact topics with the emphasis on native, indigenous perspective, to give space to talk about the things that mainstream media ignores, and solutions to global problems, breaking down this manufactured paradigm that we're born into, the paradigm of dividing not only people, but ideas, traditions, cultures, and even the earth, which ultimately ends in dividing our own minds by creating these intellectual and philosophical borders that keep us held back potentially for our whole lives and affect pretty much every waking decision that we make. So it's not just a physical border that keeps us physically separated, but it's a mental border. And I found that to be particularly striking whenever you had made that point. But not only that, I try to show the interconnectedness of all of these topics of the indigenous struggle, the border patrol, the border empire, the violence, and the profiteering of these aspects. And that's what your book does so well, is making a foundational framework for this sort of stuff to come to a central point. And I kind of had described it as like building a house, that you have to start with the framework, right? You can't just put up all the shingling and stuff and make it look fancy at the end. You got to do all the groundwork to get people to be able to see this sort of stuff. So that's what we're doing, and that's what your book did so well, was connecting all of these things. And it's a marathon, it's not a race. So yeah, the Empire of Borders was extremely informative, and I was not anticipating at all how spiritual and emotional Storming the Wall was for me. That one really hit me. Did you have anything that you wanted to say before we move on?
No, but thank you. I like that's a great introduction for one. What and Petra Molnar, was she on what radio?
She was She was on this show called Coast to Coast with George Knapp. He's a part-time host. He's like an award-winning TV journalist, and he had her on for about 2 hours, and I was able to just sneak in at the very end, and like she had already listed your books and and I was able to sneak in right at the end and talk about I name dropped you and your books and got that to George Knapp and all the audience, so that's really important. But I talked about the Border Patrol Special Forces, that they're just extrajudicial, and that they go across borders. They're not really within any border or even law. So yeah, I talked about that a little bit, and it was really good. But Petra was saying, though, that even with 2 hours, she barely could scratch the surface. And again, with this conversation, we're just barely going to be scratching the surface. Every time you go a little bit deeper, and that's kind of what I meant with it's a marathon and not a race, to inform people. So with your Empire of Borders, what did you mean by that title? And could you talk about what you went through during that book and your travels?
Yeah, so I'll start with the second part. That book was probably my most I was just following that journalistic maxim of follow the money. And what I did was I looked at um, when you look at the United States, Washington, and its programs abroad to either train or send resources to other countries as far as building up their borders, whether it be border patrol, whether it be doing trainings with police forces or military, whether it just be sending surveillance towers or biometric devices. There's 120 countries that I could have chosen from, right? And so what I did at the beginning, I just looked and tried to strategically look through those list of 120 countries, in which these 120 countries were the countries where the United States had a presence in building up another country's borders, right? And so I chose, I think it was 6 or maybe 7 or maybe it was 5, I can't remember. But I looked at that list and then I chose, based on a number of different criteria, 6, we'll say, of those 120. But it could have been another 6. It could have been. So the countries that I chose was, like the Mexico-Guatemala border, I thought was super important.
Yes.
Really, because I personally think, right, we hear when we talk about the border, it's very focused on the U.S.-Mexico border, and in some ways, very rightly so. But I think most of the quote-unquote action, if you want to look at U.S. border enforcement, has been on that Mexico-Guatemala border, and I would say that has been definitely the case for the last year, but this has been the case for the last decade. And I say the last decade because in 2014, I believe it was, yes, 2014 or 2015, Mexico started deporting more people from Central America than the United States. And before that, the United States had been deporting more people from Central America. So that one metric shows the kind of shift of this, we'll call the externalization of the U.S. border, like bringing the U.S. border 1,500 miles to the south, in this case, the Guatemala-Mexico border. And in this particular border, there's many facets to it. One is the funding that comes through the United States. It was initially through an initiative called the Merida Initiative, and it gave I think it was nearly $2 billion to Mexico for, at first, counter narcotic operations that eventually more and more focused on borders. And if you look at there was 4 pillars, and the third pillar was called creating a 21st century border. So it has this sort of Orwellian or very dystopic kind of language attached to it, even in the way that the State Department was wording it initially, right? And so you go to the Mexico-Guatemalan border, and it's obvious that there's this pretty big enforcement efforts going on. It's very different from the U.S.-Mexico border. There's no border wall, for example. You can go to the Suchiate River and see people crossing back and forth from Guatemala. So when you see like U.S. officials writing about the Mexico-Guatemalan border, they'll often say, "Oh, it's an open border. Oh, people are just crossing left and right." When in reality, people do cross in that area. However, the border really starts 10 miles inland on every highway heading north, and there's a literal gauntlet of checkpoints. A lot of immigration checkpoints, but also military and police, and sometimes all three, all the way up to different places. If you go to Tapachula, if you go north to Arriaga, where a lot of people catch the train, the Bestia going north. It's 150 miles between Tapachula and Arriaga. And I've taken that route probably 10 times, or maybe even 15 times. And there's usually more than 10 or more checkpoints on that route. And that's the border. The border is a thick inland border that the United States has played a very heavy influence in. in training Mexican immigration forces and also the military and police, as well as sending equipment, including Black Hawk helicopter, including biometric kiosks. So, from my understanding, Customs and Border Protection can actually is attached to the biometric data that Mexican immigration officials get on the southern border. So that gives you a sort of example. If you want, I can back up for a second and talk about how borders around the world are assessed and the kind of prescription, how the prescription is given by the United States for borders around the world. I don't know if you want me to do that or not.
Yeah, that would be great. I think it would also kind of echo the title Border of Empires. And before you go on, I just have to say one little anecdote. I had gone to Mexico, and going through these border checkpoints is scary for anybody that's listening that hasn't been. You got to get the books, anybody that's listening, so that you can follow up on this. But yeah, like there's armed guards, they'll be practicing shooting on the walls nearby, and you're like, geez, I hope that I don't get put on that wall, like that sort of stuff. So yeah, talk about America's role in this and the empire of borders.
Yeah, so the empire of borders, I mean, you can just the quantity, right? 120 places. And so for this book, I was able to get in the doors of CBP, their Washington headquarters. I interviewed like officials, I interviewed trainers. So I got the kind of inner mechanisms, how they went about extending the border, the U.S. border around the world. And by 120, you can probably deduce that there's more than 120 countries in the Western Hemisphere. So it goes beyond the Western Hemisphere. But it's first and foremost, that's why I wanted to start with Mexico-Guatemala, because it's first and foremost focused on the Western Hemisphere. And the idea, if you go to Customs and Border Protection strategy, the idea of layered borders, that's very much intrinsic in their language. So they'll say the United States border, in other words, what they're saying, what we think of the border often, because the way that the general public, I should say, conceptualize the border is this one line and often limited just to the U.S.-Mexico border. When you go to the strategy papers, what they say is that's the international boundary. However, the border itself is layered, and that means it ripples inland, and that we can talk about the inward ripple. And I'm sure people, in the United States know well about how internalized the U.S. border is. But right now we're talking about the externalization, and that's in this case rippling out into the world. And so Mexico-Guatemala border is one place, but that's just one ripple. And you keep going further, and you'll see that almost on every border, excluding a few countries, going south, there is some sort of U.S. border presence, whether it be the same thing as trainings and resource transfers, or like at Guatemala-Honduras border, there's a border unit called the Chorti. The Chorti. When I was down there, the first thing I was just trying to find out, it's kind of a funny story actually. The first time I went and interviewed the Chorti, and I was actually in Honduras, and I was in San Pedro Sula, and I was trying to get to this interview, which was the next morning, but I forgot that the buses don't really run at night in Honduras. So I was like, oh my God, I'm screwed. And I ended up staying in this random town, and they said, don't worry, there's a bus at 5 a.m. and you can get on that bus. So I get on the 5 a.m. bus, right? And then the bus driver stops and has this hour-long breakfast. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to be so late. So I'm desperately trying to call Guatemala City and telling, because it's actually in this other place called Zacapa.
Oh my God.
But I'm trying to call them and say, I'm going to be super late for this. And I'm not getting through to anyone. And so I end up being late, right? And so I get across the border in Guatemala. Of course, the border takes a while too, of course. But I get across the border, and then I try to get on a bus, and then I realize, screw it, I can't get on. This isn't going to work. So I get in a cab, and I just floor it to Zacapa. And 2 hours late, and I'm all flustered. I get out, and I'm just my shirt is everywhere, and and I start to talk to these soldiers that are at the gatekeepers really, and I tell them I had this interview with the commander of the Chorti, and then this is the most one of the most educational moments because what I was going there to do, and I thought it might be harder than I realized what was harder than it actually was. Well, I was trying to say, okay, I'm pretty sure the United States is very involved in this Border Patrol unit. And I have to come in here, I'm going to interview that, and I hope he tells me and reveals, or I'm going to try to have a good interrogative interview to get this out of him. So I'm sitting there just waiting, and they made some phone calls, and then the next thing I knew, a soldier came back to me and said, "Are you with Bortak?" And I just like, oh my gosh, and I'm like, it was probably a 19-year-old soldier, and so Bortak is the border, you know this, Brendan, but Bortak is the Border Patrol Tactical Unit, so it's Bortak, and they're the unit that's charged with doing the international trainings, and they're a significant part of the Border Patrol, but nobody in the U.S. knows about them. No one. I mean, a few people do, but when I talked about Empire of Borders when it first came out, and I do book talks, I'd ask the audience, I'd say, who do you know? Anyone heard of Bortak? And really only like occasionally one or two people, but usually nobody. So having this 19-year-old soldier in Guatemala, in Zacapa, say, are you from Bortak? I was like, oh yeah, they have been here. Bortak has been here. And it turns out, yeah, I got to meet with the commander. First thing he tells me is like, "Oh, we were funded by the U.S. Embassy." He just said it for very first thing he said, and that Bortak was there for 3 months, and not only Bortak, but other units. I think ICE was there. I can't remember right now. By the book, you can see, but I think ICE was there. There's a bunch of other U.S. military was there. So that was the first time. The second time I went. A couple years later, there was an actual U.S. military advisor who was on the base, who was working with the Guatemalan force. And so it's just in a nutshell kind of what happened. So what happened before that, so the Chorti formed in 2015, I believe. So before that, 2014, we'll say 2014, 2013, or whenever. I don't know when this happened, but there was an assessment period. So what happens is Customs and Border Protection, they will go to sites, border sites, and really like a doctor looking at like what they would call a patient who's sick or something like that. They go and check out a border and give an assessment of the border. So like the one I know most about was the Dominican-Haiti border, where CBP sent a team around 2006, I believe it was, to that border. And I actually got a little bit of what they said officially after that in 2006. So a CBP team goes there. They look at the border. They write down, oh, this is missing. You need this. You need this. You need the other thing. They basically said for the Dominican-Haiti border, it was quote unquote porous. I'm sure people have heard that term used before. Porous, right? You could counter go like skin membranes are porous or something like that.
Or like
but
a
anyhow,
sponge.
porous, yeah, like a sponge, right? And then they said that Dominican Republic needed a border patrol. And so how influential are such assessments? I'll have to say pretty damn influential, right? Because the next year, 2007 comes along, and by presidential decree, the Dominican president says we're going to form our border patrol, and then 2008, this border patrol forms in Dominican Republic called CESFRONT. That's the acronym, CESFRONT, and then there was all these trainings. U.S. Border Patrol came in, all kinds of resource transfers of everything, like just from flashlights to bulletproof vests to like bulletproof to weapons and bullets. And in the Guatemalan case, they had all these armored jeeps. Like I can't remember how many, but a whole fleet of armored jeeps. And they actually gave me the Guatemalan Force gave me a demonstration using these armored jeeps. Like, so we like saw them. I had a commander next to me with his clock, and he was saying, "Look how fast they're doing it." And they get on, and they put on like this, it was one of the jeeps you could pop out off, in through the roof, I guess, and put up artillery on top. So that's what they did. They went from just the armored jeeps. They all put their machine guns on top, and they all like seven of these vehicles, armored jeeps, all donated by the United States. Went super quick, and they made a checkpoint. They were showing me how quickly they could make a checkpoint. Right?
Like it's a game.
Kind of like it's a game, but in a way, like, I think they didn't know that I was a journalist who might be critical of this. I think also because there was zero journalism on it at all, at least from an international sphere, that I was almost treated like a person from the U.S. Embassy or something like that. It was strange because they gave me a whole PowerPoint presentation, and I said, I'm a journalist, and I'm looking at it, and of course I don't go and say, oh, I'm going to be critical of what you're doing.
Yeah.
But I had the feeling that they were just treating me in such a way, almost in a diplomatic way, rather than here's a journalist, where they might have not done as much as they did. Because I know for a fact, because of INL, which is that's one of the U.S. agencies through the State Department. It's like the International Bureau on Narcotics and Law Enforcement. They call it the INL. INL is one of the agencies the United States uses to transfer money to these externalized border operations. So, because Department of Homeland Security cannot do foreign assistance. And so because they cannot do it, there's only two departments, State Department and Department of Defense, that can do what they call foreign assistance, according to the Foreign Assistance Act. So when Department of Homeland Security wants to extend the borders, they can't do it unless they partner with State Department or DOD. And in this case, it was the State Department, the INL. And after that trip to Guatemala and then Zacapa and to the military base where they did all that and showed me all the demonstrations, and I talked to the U.S. military advisor quite a bit, who was actually from Brownsville, and he was actually very critical of the border himself, which I found super interesting.
Yeah,
right?
That's
he was
fascinating.
critical of it was very fascinating, and he was critical of the border there too. He's like, oh, the borders. He even made the point, he's like, oh, there's peoples that live on both sides of the border, and these borders, you put down the nation states right between these peoples, like in this case, the Maya Chorti that he was referring to. And he knew all that, yet his 25th year in the military, he had been assigned to be the military advisor for 1 year in Zacapa, helping them start their own border patrol. So it has all these interesting nuances and little things that go along with it. But I found that part interesting too. But anyhow, that's the kind of process. You have the assessment, and then you have the United States says, okay, we can do this, this, and this. We can send this to you. We can send trainings to you. And then you're going to build up this border patrol. And the whole idea in my thesis in Empire Borders is that that when you think of if you think of U.S. empire, or if you want to think of how empire works in the world right now, but let's just talk about U.S. empire, this extension of the border, this kind of controlling of borders that ripples throughout the Western Hemisphere, whether it be Latin America or the Caribbean, and it ripples out into the world. And I also went, and we can talk more about this, to Jordan, to Philippines, to Kenya, to Israel-Palestine, where Israel-Palestine, I really looked at the industry. We can also talk about the industry.
Yeah,
but this
that
ripples
part is
out.
fascinating.